the State Department during the Bush administration, the George W. Bush administration. And of course, I mean, you know, we were, during that time, going to the State Department and so on, everybody was focused on US wars in Afghanistan, and then, of course, in Iraq and so on. So it consumed a great deal of the discussion. The imperial sort of posture and so on was always omnipresent, and we would always attempt to see what is the reasoning, what is the logic, the lies and so on. Of course, Iraq proved that during the Iraq War, the launching of the Iraq War was basically a complete abdication by the media of what was going on and what was to become. Everybody is aware of the New York Times, for instance, I don't want to name and so on, that basically went on peddling, lies, made-up stories and so on, for which they would come a few years later and say, yeah, oops, we made a mistake, So this is the kind of thing that we do. We try to hold them, to hold their feet to the fire, see what they're doing, how they go about it. Very quickly, I would say that the difference is very shallow between a Democratic administration and a Republican administration. With the exception, of course, of this crazy period of the Trump administration. I mean, when it was the Secretary of State Tillerson was always missing in action anyway. I mean, he came to the briefing, I think, maybe once or twice. Pompeo was more present, but he's evangelical. I mean, to his credit, he always gave me a question, Pompeo, but always his responses and so on were very, very hostile and, unapologetic. I mean, he's the guy that said that settlements were not an obstacle. You can have peace and have settlement. He's the guy that had, they had, I think, wine named after him from the settlement and so on. So, they were belligerent and they were not change. And sure enough, I mean, the spokesperson, the first spokesperson, Ned Price, came in and he was more forthcoming on the Palestinian issue, And they would say, look, they readopted the old things, and they talked about the two-state solution, which was missing from the previous administration. They committed themselves to refinancing UNRWA, which they did, soon thereafter. But of course, they never fulfilled their promises to reopen the PLO office in Washington. And that's one of the things that they said, they told us, whether, on background, on real briefing, that they will do. They never reopened the consulate in East Jerusalem, although they kept saying time after time. They never, of course, remember, I mean, on the Iran issue, for instance, Biden came into office promising that on day one he's going to go back to the agreement, which they did not. So I would say that this was the case, until October 7th. After October 7th, it is pure hostility. I mean, this is the spokesperson, and I'm sorry to say, but if you listen to the Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, and what he says, he articulates the Israeli position a lot better than Israel Katz, the Israeli foreign minister. Nobody knows who he is, but everybody knows that Blinken is there. He's been there 9 times. He's always, advocating for the Israeli position. So this is the kind of atmosphere that you have.
Thank you to ADC for holding this convention, and it's an honor to be with you all. That's a very big question. I'm not sure how much time we have, but obviously there are very deep, intrinsic, ongoing issues with media coverage of Palestine, both in terms of what's happening in Palestine, in Gaza and the West Bank, as well as what's happening in the United States in terms of the repression against Palestinian activism and advocacy. And it's really difficult to know where to start, but I can say that we've seen some patterns of, I would say, media malpractice, particularly, obviously, like I said, this has been going on for a very long time, but in terms of since October 7th, And I know that all of you, as consumers of media, have seen it too. This is not something that only journalists notice. But I can tell you as a journalist that these elements of media malpractice are things that are really inherent to the practice of journalism, in which there is a Palestine exception in terms of just the egregious malpractice that we're seeing. So we saw from the very beginning a regurgitation of Israeli talking points and propaganda, things like beheaded babies, that Hamas conducted a campaign of mass rape on October 7th, an effort to brand Hamas as Hamas ISIS, which didn't seem to catch on as much, a sort of, again, regurgitation of excuses for why they're bombing hospitals. So the fact that Al-Shifa Hospital, for example, is a Hamas command and control node. And it doesn't matter how many times the Israeli military and government are proven to have lied, misled, even been caught lying. We had one particularly shocking example of sort of Israeli accounts tweeting out a nurse from Al-Shifa Hospital. Do you all remember that? Who turned out to be an actress? I mean, sometimes if the stakes weren't so high, where we're talking about tens of thousands of Palestinians being killed in Gaza, it's comical how bad the propaganda is. And yet, the American, Western, and British media continue to rely on them as sources, to regurgitate the propaganda, to put it on the front pages. And of course, there are exceptions for this. There are examples of people within the mainstream Western media who are doing very good work, who are shedding light on the war crimes that are happening in Gaza. But unfortunately, that is small and when you look at the big picture of how these propaganda, the regurgitation of propaganda is actually shaping minds. So when you actually look at polls, the fact that many Americans think that more Israelis have been killed than Palestinians, the fact that many people don't even know who's occupying who or what the context. So of course you see a complete, I would say allergy to covering any kind of contextual history of how we got to October 7th. So of course, October 7th is portrayed as the beginning of the story, and so on and so forth. So I think these are just some of the examples. And then of course, you have the very blatant fact that there are things happening every single day in Gaza that if they were happening anywhere else in the world would be breaking news alerts, would be huge news, using starvation as a weapon of war, the fact that children and people in Gaza are starving to death, the fact that you have this pattern of Israeli soldiers dressing up in Palestinian women's like undergarments. I mean, the genocidal rhetoric in Israeli society at all levels, from people to military officials to journalists, and so on and so forth. I mean, like I said, we could literally be here all day just running down the list of stories that are not covered how they should be covered, and of course the propaganda that has been regurgitated in order to justify the slaughter of Palestinians.